And today's subject is also fascinating, and that is Bible criticism. And that is obviously, as we may or may not be aware, that is the application of scientific method to determine A, the proper content of the Torah, the Bible, and B, authorship. And this has been a relatively recent field, starting in the mid-1700s till present day. And it has presented unique challenges to what the Jews have traditionally believed. And I want to start with that because it's a little bit of a misconception in the secular world or in the academic world as to what Jews, and for that matter Christians, have traditionally believed. If you look at the very first line, and I just pull this from Wikipedia, very first line of Wikipedia about the documentary hypothesis, and that's the name we'll hear about. The documentary hypothesis is the most widely accepted theory of Bible criticism. The first line is as follows, quote, "The traditional view that Moses was the author of the Torah came under increasing and detailed scrutiny in the 17th century." And thus, they're presenting that the traditional view was that Moshe is the author. Moses is the author, single author, and comes along Bible criticism, and they challenge that premise. Is it one author? Is it two authors? Is it five authors? Is it 10 authors? Was it all put together by some redactor, some editor? When was it written? Was it written at one time? Was it written over 400, 500 years? That is what Bible criticism came to contend with. If you've read, perhaps you've seen maybe the most popular book on the subject, a fellow by the name of Richard Elliott Friedman wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible, wherein he is working under the premise that Moshe is the author according to tradition. In truth, the tradition has always claimed that Moshe is not the author. Moshe is the typist, he's the scribe, he's the stenographer. He writes down what God dictates to him. And this is a critical point. And in fact, if you look at the Talmud, which is written 2,000 years ago, and thus can justly be considered the traditional Jewish perspective, the Talmud says in the book of Sanhedrin, page 90, 90a that is, in the bottom, that there are certain people whose beliefs are in such direct contrast to Torah, to Judaism, that they cut themselves off from the Jewish people. And it gives a whole long list of the heathens and the heretics and the people that have all these beliefs that are antithetical to Judaism. And one of them is someone who questions the divinity of the Torah. Ha-omer, right, that the Torah is not min hashamayim, the Torah is not from heaven. And the Talmud goes on to explain, what does that mean? So it gives a whole long list of people that are included in this category. And it says, even if he says that the entire Torah is divine, except for one verse. Means if someone says, hey, I believe all the Torah is divine, but there's one verse in Deuteronomy, or one verse in Leviticus, or Exodus, or Genesis, whatever, that was not written by the Holy One, blessed is He. Rather, Moses said it himself. That, too, is included under the category of people that lose that portion of the world to come, that are cut from the Jewish people, because they reject the central premise of Judaism, that the Torah is divine. So what the Talmud is telling us, that not only is Moshe not the author from traditional perspective, but if you ascribe one verse in the Torah out of the 5,845 verses, one of them you say, this is not God, this is Moshe himself, then you are rejecting what the traditional perspective has been. So ironically, the very starting point of a lot of Bible criticism is that the traditional viewpoint is that Moshe is the author, and they want to contest that. That point is actually untrue. It's a misconception. It's not true. Traditionally, we believe that God's the author, Moshe is the stenographer, Moshe writes down what God dictates to him. And that's a crucial point, and we'll revisit that again and again. Now, on that point, it's interesting. There is a question as to the authorship or as to the writing down of the last 8 verses of the Torah. Because if you read the end of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moshe. And it describes the death of Moshe. Moshe and Moses are the same character, obviously. So Moshe is about to die, and he's prepared to die, and then 8 verses to the end, Moshe dies, and the Torah gives a little eulogy of Moshe. You know, his great accomplishments, and what he taught us, and what he gave us, and all the miracles that were done via him. Could that have been written by Moshe?
Sure.
Well, Could it or could it not? So that's an interesting question. The Talmud addresses that question. And it has a whole debate. So one opinion says, wait a minute. Moshe describes his death, right? So how could Moshe be writing it right before him? Well, so that's, but if he's a prophet, he could write once we accept the premise that Moshe wrote the whole thing with God telling him what to do, clearly he has the capacity to communicate with God. If he has the capacity to communicate with God, God tells him, hey, this is what's going to happen in the future, write it down now. Go ahead.
Well, if God is the author, then he told
Moshe to write down.
Moshe how he's going to die, and he wrote it down before
Right.
he died.
So the Talmud has two opinions. One opinion says that Joshua wrote it, and one opinion says that Moshe wrote it with tears. And the simple understanding of that is that Moshe is being told about his own demise, and that's, of course, very unsettling for someone. And he has to write his own obituary. That's obviously, so he wrote it with tears. It's a simple understanding. There's other interpretations about that. But either way, the only verses that traditionally have been ascribed to anyone other than Moshe writing it is the last 8 verses. That being said, even those last 8 verses, and even the rest of the Torah, the actual author, who's determining what word goes in, what word goes out, that's God. I'll give you guys an example. If you buy any book in the store, do you assume that the person who wrote the book, who's the author of the book, actually typed it out? Maybe yes, maybe no. Who knows, right? But the point is that we don't look at the typist, at the stenographer, as they're the author of the work. If the Talmud is telling us here that if you say that Moshe does not have editorial control over even one sentence, it's insane to say that Moshe is the author. So that's, I think, the starting point. And I think that once we have this perspective of the traditional viewpoint as to the authorship of the Torah, that presents the whole discussion of Bible criticism in a different light. Obviously, it does raise other questions. How would God write a book? How would a book authored by a divine entity that's not bound by time and space, the definition that Jews have given to God, how would that work? That would be a very interesting analysis. Like, once you accept the premise of God as the author, Moshe merely the typist, well, that is a very interesting analysis to say, okay, how would this book be written if it wasn't authored by a human? It means we have to kind of change the frame of reference. It means if we want to kind of analyze a book and try to question the authorship, and then we say, hey, it's either this guy or that guy or this guy or 5 other people, that is kind of one frame of reference, as opposed to if we say, is it a human or is it God? That's an entirely different equation. And then we'll try to get to that in a little bit. I want to just stress this point a little bit further. Maimonides, once again, we could make the very good argument that he did more than anyone else to codify what the traditional perspective of Judaism has been. He writes in one of his 13 principles that God's the author. Moshe wrote it all down. That's part of it. Moshe is the conduit, the prophet who writes it all down, every word. He obviously goes with the opinion of the Talmud that Moshe wrote even the last 8 verses. But God's the author, and if you question that, you are going against one of the 13 principles of faith. Okay, so that was the perspective. Now, there has been some revisionist history about certain Jewish commentators, most notably Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, one of the great medieval commentators in the Torah. There have been allegations that he, too, questioned the veracity of the Torah. For example, there are many times where he writes, as you could read a line, I won't get too bogged down with the details, but there are certain instances where he writes that this verse or these verses is a secret. He gives this kind of mysterious, kind of dodgy analysis of a problem. And there have those that have said or made the argument that Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, the great commentator on the Torah, is essentially intimating that Moshe is not the author. That's number one. Number two, there are other cases where he writes, quote, these are the words of Moshe, Eila divrei Moshe. But if you actually analyze that, what he's actually saying is that he's referring to a narration in the middle of a dialogue. So, for example, if you have one verse, one sentence, and it talks about what someone says, and then in the middle of the sentence, it meanders into a narration. So it's the third person talking. So what he says, these are the words of Moshe, i.e. not the words of Jacob or of Abraham that begin the sentence. But no way does that imply that Moshe is A, the author, or B, he has any oversight on the actual content. Rather, these are the words of the narrator, and he calls it Moshe, i.e. the third person perspective. We could kind of dive into this. It's very textual, but it's very, very different. It means the claim that the traditional scholars, most notably the Ibn Ezra, was of the belief that the Torah was not what it claims to be, is very dubious. It's very dubious. But it has been written in some books, as Richard Elliott Freeman writes it. He kind of takes it as for granted when it's not absolutely clear at all. Okay, so that's the basic attitude that has been prevalent in the Jewish and certainly as well the Christian community for time immemorial. In the 17th century, this idea of using scientific methodology to critically examine the Torah was developed. We could talk about who the forebearer is. But we have someone like Baruch or Benedict Spinoza, who is often painted as the father of criticism, Bible criticism. But the idea gets developed over some time to actually question what we have traditionally accepted. Now, it's important to note, and we're going to stress this as well, that when we say science, everyone gets scared because you don't want to argue with science, right? We don't want to be the people that are the Luddites, so to speak, that rejects the flat Earth society people. It's important to realize that this is a very soft science. It's kind of like archaeology. There's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of malleability in the evidence, and the evidence doesn't necessarily say what it is, it is portrayed to have said. If you find something in a certain strata, you find a little pottery shard. For us, it's immaterial. For an archaeologist, they can write a whole book about it, right? Because there's a lot of conjecture that can be taken very far with very, very little actual substantial evidence. And Bible criticism is the same way. And what's clear is that there's nothing firm. We don't look at the Torah critically as a proof for the divinity of the Torah. And the argument as well that the Torah, if the literary analysis of the Torah categorically disproves the divinity of the Torah, is also hogwash. It means we can't take radical steps either way. Yes.
When you say Bible criticism, you mean textual criticism?
Right. So we get the two kinds of Bible criticism. So the Bible criticism separates into two forms. There's what's called lower Bible criticism, which is essentially finding the correct text of the Torah, making slight amendations within the actual text. It's not about the analysis of the authorship of the text. That's known as higher Bible criticism. And what's interesting is that lower Bible criticism, which is actual analysis of the text, not to try to prove or disprove authorship, but just to try to find the true text, that has been present for a long, long time before the 17th century. We go back to the Masoretes of the 7th and 8th and 9th century that spent a lot of time trying to find the correct text. And it was interesting that, the actual text of the Torah, we have 304,805 letters in the Torah, right? They're all copied by hand. We don't have the ability to print them, right? Mass publication, mass dissemination of written documents comes much later. So we have Torah scrolls that have to be 100% accurate. If you have a Torah scroll that's missing a letter, has two letters touching, one letter chipped, has a mistake in the letter, is missing one of the letters, that could happen, right, at 304,000 plus letters. And over the course of time, you have one Torah scroll, you copy another Torah scroll, who knows how far away the actual text is from the original. So lower criticism is the pursuit of the correct text the way it was originally.
It has not been proven.
Oh, yes. So interestingly, it has been proven. We have in 1947 the most significant the archaeological discovery of all time, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In southern Israel, in a very dry place, they found in the caves extant texts, right, of all of the books of the Bible. And they found things that were preserved because of the climate for thousands of years. The actual dates, there's some that say it's 2,200 years old, some that say it's 2,300 years old. But either way, we have existing texts today, you could Google them online, that are exact copies of the Torahs that we read in today's shuls.
So let's just be clear, we don't have the full Torah, we have sections.
Yes.
I just want to make sure I understand.
That's true, but whatever we have matches.
Okay.
And there are some books that were more prevalent than others. Like, for example, the book of Isaiah was super popular. The people that were the dead, what's known as the Dead Sea sect, most likely they're the Essenes, known as today as the Essenes. They were people that had a kind of a twist on Judaism that was very apocalyptic. Therefore, they went to live in caves, and most likely they were celibate, which is obviously not a way to guarantee perpetuity. They were celibate and living in caves, and the end is near. And if you are into that kind of stuff, the book of Isaiah will be very popular. So they found many, 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 many copies of Isaiah, but they found copies of everyone. Now, I don't know if they found everything was complete, because if you look at the scroll, there's obviously holes and patches within it, but they found almost everything. Not only that, we look at the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza was another greatest archaeological discovery of text that they found in Cairo. And they found an unimaginable amount of documents, and we compare them to today's. Well, now, granted, that's only 1,000 years old, but we compare that to today's documents, and they're identical. Now, I say they're identical. That's actually not entirely true. They're almost identical. The margin of error of all the existing Torah scrolls is 9 letters. That's it.
I thought it was just one that was found in Ethiopia.
Well, so the thing is like this. First of all, those letters, none of those letters change the meaning of the word. Now, you say, wait a minute, Rabbi, how's it possible to have an extra letter or missing a letter and have it not change the word? The answer is chaserot and yeteot, which means in Hebrew is a unique kind of alphabet wherein the vowels are frequently in the form of nikudot. Nikudot, those little dots and lines and dashes under and above the letters. Now, in the Torah, sometimes the vowels are put in the form of letters. Sometimes they're not put in the form of letters. And therefore, all the 9 letters, all the discrepancies that we have in all the Torahs are either examples where where we have, for example, we have the vowel and they don't have the vowel, or they have the vowel and we don't have the vowel. So there's not a single word that's missing or added between the Torahs. So that kind of makes the discovery of ancient books that verify that our Torahs are accurate, that kind of makes the scientific methods of lower criticism really moot. We don't really need that. What's interesting, as a side point, I'll get a second, Sharon, that the tefillah, the prayer, was never written down. Prayer was almost always was memorized. And the reason for that probably is because to write something down, you wouldn't do it unless you had to read it. So if you just memorize it, it's much simpler. Everything by hand, and it was very laborious, very expensive to write things down. But because it wasn't written down, it wasn't read, and it wasn't, we didn't have the same precision that we have in copying Torah scrolls. Therefore, we have regional differences in prayers. If you look at the Sephardic prayer book and the Ashkenazic prayer book, they're different. And the reason is because, that's what happens. If you have a body of text that hasn't been written down, hasn't been preserved with the absolute highest regard for accuracy over the years, it's going to get distorted. That's just the reality, Sharon.
Okay, my question was the Greek.
The Septuagint?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Septuagint.
There are some discrepancies with that.
Yes. So the Septuagint is the first translation of the Torah, about the year 245 before the Common Era. Ptolemy II, the Greek emperor at the time, he commissioned, which is a nice way of saying, he forced a group of 70 rabbis to translate the Torah into Greek. And we still have that today. So it's interesting, any analysis we have of the Torah, we know it's been in foreign but non-Jewish hands, which is a little bit of an outside verification for about 2,200 years. Now, there are discrepancies between that and the Torah. In fact, the Talmud even talks about how they deliberately changed they made 36 emendations to the Torah because they didn't translate well. So the Torah in its original Hebrew is a very malleable language. So one word can have multiple meanings. And there's a lot of nuance that's baked into the Torah. You translate that to Greek, and then you lose a lot of that. And therefore, a lot of that subtleties that cannot be translated to other languages had to be amended to prevent misinterpretation.
Can you talk about the passage? I'm sorry if I'm interrupting. There's a passage where it's about, I think it's Reuben, where they leave out, they think they may have left out some of the words got left
So I'm not expert in all the different
Okay.
discrepancies that they
There
make.
was actually more in the Greek version.
Yeah, either they tweaked it. It means they tweaked it in several places.
But, and the legend was that all 70 scribes.
That's right. So the Talmud says that all 70 scribes were able to.
They all matched.
They all matched, even though they were secluded. Yeah. So that's it. That's interesting. Okay, so that's lower criticism. So really, I think today, when we talk about Bible criticism, it's going to be higher Bible criticism because that hasn't been settled, at least from the academic community, even though it's changed a lot. The authorship. And it's important to realize, we have to always remember this, that the starting point for a secular academic is going to be human authorship. And the question is, which human? Was it Moses? Was it Ezra? Was it Jeremiah? Was it just a collaboration of a bunch of rabbis? Was it one guy? Was it three guys over hundreds of years over one time? That's going to be the starting point. It's a human author. And we traditionally have had a different starting point, and that, I think, is going to be very insightful in our understanding of the traditional response to this. Now, so what they do? So they examine the style of writing. They examine vocabulary, to see if there's consistency. They did literary and textual analysis, primarily. One of the big points of Bible criticism is the various names of God. So if you look at the Torah, you read the Torah, there's many names that are given to the divine entity we call God. There's a name that has 4 letters, what's known as the tetragram, which is the name that we can't say, that it starts with a J or a Y. There's the name of Elohim. There's other names that aren't even mentioned, like Shakai, or we don't say the names out. We don't say the names explicitly as we need to. But there's multiple names for God in the Torah, and that made people question, wait a minute, why would you give a single entity multiple names? If you give,
don't we say?
Huh? Well, we don't say any of the names.
I'm just kidding.
Well, we don't say them because actually one of the 10 Commandments is not to say God's name in vain. So we don't say them. We can reference them, kind of give euphemisms to them. Call them by other names. But the question was raised, wait a minute, why are there multiple names? Why, if you're referencing the same entity, which is what we have believed, why would you call him or it by different names?
A different aspect of God.
Oh, well, okay, well, that's an answer, right? But the question kind of was raised, and I want to make this point clear a little bit later. The question is not the problem, but the analysis, the questioning of the text is what we've been doing for a long time. The academics questioning it and them jumping to conclusions that are not a lot of conjecture baked into that. That is what we are. That's what's the surface. Now, so there's names of gods. There's apparently inconsistencies. There's contradictions. Things are repeated. There's doublets and triplets and redundancies, and things which are anachronistic, which means that they're not up to the time. So if you talk about a helicopter in the 14th century, that's anachronistic, right? There's no helicopters then. Retelling of certain episodes, right? How many times was Adam created? If you read Genesis very critically, you'll notice that Adam was actually created twice. If you look at the story of Sarah being taken by a foreign king as a hostage or as a sex slave or whatnot, like that's told twice. Now, granted, it's 2 different kings. It's possible 2 separate episodes, but that made the academics question: is this the same episode? It was just retold twice and then morphed or edited together by another entity. Over the years, the theory developed, and there was a conclusion that the only way to reconcile the material was if they were authored by multiple people who were writing down maybe the same tradition or same legend or same folklore or same tale, fairy tale, if you will, and you have these multiple documents. Therefore, there's multiple names because this guy gave the name that begins with J, and this one gave the name that begins with E, and then another guy blended them all together, stitched them all up, and then we presented that as a Torah, and that's the book we have today. That is the premise that emerged, that the 5 books of Moshe were actually not written by Moshe, all of them. Maybe Moshe was one of the people involved, maybe yes, maybe no, that's a debate. But were multiple authors who lived over hundreds of years. That came a little bit later, but that the person who put it all together, a fellow by the name of a German academic by the name of Julius Wellhausen, and he kind of organized it in the way that kind of put all the elements of the theory together. What became known as the documentary hypothesis emerged. We have the book today, but really it is a composite work, multiple authors over hundreds of years put together. Primarily, we have the E document. So that's the document that has the name of Elohim. We have the J document, which is the name of the 4-letter name of God. We have the D document, which is Deuteronomy, which they say came later, which is very interesting. Why they say it came later. And we have the L document, or the priestly code Leviticus, which came much earlier. And then we have the 5th guy, which is R, which is the redactor, who put it all together and organized it and edited it and made it all nice and neat and gave us the Torah. Now, the actual aspects of the theory, the particular aspects have been debated and developed over the years. In fact, there were other books that were added, other alleged sources to the book. We have the C document, the K document, the S, the PG, not the movie rating, but the P, lowercase g, the P1, the P2. And I noted while researching this, it looks like, if you look at the Torah in the light of Bible criticism, it looks like a bowl of alphabet soup.
So it's not just the 4 basic.
Well, over
there's more categories.
Well, that's the argument, and it looks like that's what you have. It's a bowl of alphabet soup, alphabet cereal, and not the word of a living God.
Book that outlines this? Or
Well, there's a lot of books. There's a lot of books written. I say if you want to read about this theory, Richard Elliott Freeman does a good job for a layman. Now, I want to mention, when I read his book, I disagreed with almost every single word. Literally, there's almost nothing I can agree, just as a starting point, Like I said, his starting point is Moshe's the author. If Moshe's the author, why would a human write in certain things? He doesn't ever entertain the idea of a divine author. So, go ahead.
I think this is an appropriate time to ask a question.
Go ahead, always.
So as you were talking about with the names, God is inevitable. We don't, every time we try to define God, we have by definition, that's a non-God. We cannot.
Well, so it's interesting.
But
Go ahead.
If that's the case, I'm sorry
Go ahead.
to interrupt you, sir.
Go ahead, Dan.
And these other scientific descriptions don't necessarily contradict that. Why do we look at it as an either-or thing? It could very well be God does things that we don't understand all the time. So these folks were driven by God to write this thing and scribe it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a contradiction there necessarily.
Okay. So your idea I like a lot, to try to not necessarily present everything in opposition. I think that in the Christian world, for example, in another area of conflict between religion and science, there's always been this pitting of religion versus science, when in Judaism we look at science as God's handiwork, right? That's the way God made the world. And why would that be in opposition to the existence of God? It doesn't mean God created the world, okay. Do we know which method he used? Well, we have 31 verses in Genesis. Is that an exhaustive detailing of Genesis? Clearly not. No one would make that argument, right? Is it possible that God employed evolution to do it? Why not? Is it possible that God employed a Big Bang? Why not? So I think in most areas, we like to find harmony between science and Torah, science and religion, science and God, and that's always going to be preferable, because we really don't disagree. The source and the process are different. That's number one. Here, what science is making a claim, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in a little bit, that it's not science. I don't want to call it science because it's not quite, but the scientific perspective, as employed by the Bible critics, has been to negate the divinity of the Torah and negate the cohesiveness of the Torah. Now, if the Torah was a book, a composite book of multiple authors put together by humans without prophecy, well, then what value does it have for us? What lasting value should it have for us? Yeah, it may be a wonderful document, but is it absolutely true or not? Well, if it's a book written by man, well, then it may have been a very intelligent man, may have been one of the greatest law systemizers and moral codifiers that the world's ever seen. Fantastic. But if we have a different moral, if we have a different code, if we want to disagree with that human, we can. What gives the Torah its value and its lasting value is the fact that we claim that it comes from God. If it comes from God, well, then it's not up to debate. We can't argue with God. We don't have the capacity to say, well, I disagree. We can't cut out little sections that we don't like. We can't add or subtract. Right? There's no amendments to the Torah if it's divine. However, if it was written by man, even if it was a great man, a successful man, or people, or women, or whoever, if it's of human authorship, then it's very much up for our, it's our choice. If we want to accept it, reject it, add it, subtract it, ignore it, it doesn't really hold, the lasting quality that the Torah has always been. So I find no place here for harmony. These are in opposition. Now, does this sufficiently answer your question?
Certainly does. Thank you.
Yes. Now, I want to make another point here. Now, I don't want to go all apocalyptic on Bible criticism because I think, and I mentioned this point earlier, I think there's a lot of value here. If you go to a yeshiva and you see people studying Torah, in the most what you would say is an almost violent way. Like they're screaming at each other, they're arguing, there's argumentation. And why? Because they're arguing over text. So it may be the Torah text, maybe Mishnah text, maybe Talmud text, it may be text of later scholars. But the idea of critically analyzing the text, that has been the modus operandi of the Jewish learning for time immemorial. We find in the Talmud. Talmud says that the proper way to study is two people, even a teacher and a student, and even the father and a son, that when they get to the Torah, they argue it out. And they argue with such tenacity, with such ferociousness, that they start hating each other. Start hating each other. That's what it says. But then, once they finish studying, they love each other again. And we still have this today. If you go to yeshiva in Israel, you walk in, you feel like we walked into a mental institution. You just see 1,000 young students screaming at each other. What's going on over here? The answer is they're trying to pursue the truth. And they're pursuing the truth via analysis of text. So analysis of text, critique of text, noticing problems, noticing patterns, asking questions. Why are things said this way? Why are they not said that way? Asking questions about redundancies and contradictions. That is what we've been doing for time immemorial. So the idea of asking questions is something that we very much embrace. Yes?
Well, what this gentleman was saying, where in this whole, it's always amazed me where science and the Torah, to make a long story short, where did the dinosaurs and all the other things that we know scientifically happen? Where does it happen within the 7 days of creation?
Yeah. So there's two. I don't want to go too deep into this, but there's two general approaches to that question. One approach is the idea of using Einstein's theory of relativity, that the 6 days are actually billions of years. To us, they may look like billions of years, but at the time there were six days. Concerning some articles on that, very fascinating stuff. Actually, Einstein made it very easy for us to find compatibility with either 15.4, now it's 13.8 billion years. That's one position. There's another position that looks at events like the flood to have been so catastrophic for the world that has, artificially aged, so to speak, fossils and caused so much chaos in the strata that makes it look to us like they're 65 million years old, when in fact they're a couple of thousand years old. Those are the two primary approaches to that question as to the existence of dinosaurs, right? The Torah says that many animals became extinct at the time. It does talk about taninim gedolim, these large, taninim is like a snakes or lizards of sorts. It does talk about in the Torah, and there are those that have theorized that that's referring to dinosaurs. I don't know. But either way, it has been discussed, and there has been an attempt to try to find compatibility between those. Like I said, that's one element of a big picture. There's many books written on this subject. So Bible criticism in itself, that is something we embrace. Like I said, you go to yeshiva, you'll see Bible criticism, people asking questions, people legitimately trying to find the truth in the text. Like, that isn't the problem. Now, with a slight caveat, I would say that some of the Bible critics, maybe the tone that they use is a little bit different. There is a little bit of a cynical tone in some of these books, where they look at traditionalists as being a little bit arcane, a little bit backwater, a little bit kind of clinging onto ancient myths as being truth. So there is a little bit of that, which I think is problematic. But the actual idea of trying to use sophisticated methods of analysis and questioning the text is something that we very much embrace. Now, the problem is not the question, the problem is the conclusions. And to your point, Daniel, what are the implications of taking the Torah and downgrading it from being a divine document from God directly to Moshe? These are the absolute words of God. Taking that and changing it to human authors. What changes? What now must result if that were to be true? So, like we said earlier, number one, it repudiates our religion. Right? The religion that we and our forebears and all of our ancestry, all the way back to Sinai, back to Abraham, we're about 100 generations, they have steadfastly adhered to this religion, and they believe that it's true. Now, when we choose to question the legitimacy, the veracity, the historicity of the Torah, we're essentially putting into doubt the existence of our religion. Our religion is predicated on the fact that this Torah is what it claims to be. If the Torah is a fraud, if the Torah is a hoax, then our religion likewise is a fraud and a hoax. And what does that imply about all of our ancestors? All of our ancestors that believed in it, and many of them gave up their lives to uphold the Torah. There's been millions of Jews, and I guarantee you everyone in this room has an ancestor that unfortunately was the sufferer of anti-Semitism, and many of them were killed for what they believed. So Jews have always took the Torah very, very seriously because they believed that it was true. If we want to question that, we have to realize the gravity of that conclusion. That takes what preceded us and invalidates it. And dare I say, what's crueler? To kill someone for what they believe, or to make their death meaningless? In Judaism, we have always looked at the martyrs as the greatest heroes. Someone like Rabbi Akiva in the year 135, where the Romans made a rule against Torah study, against circumcision, against observance of the Shabbat, and Rabbi Akiva said, I'm teaching Torah defiantly. And they said, okay, and they captured him, put him in prison. Eventually, they said, we're going to kill you in the most horrible, gruesome, horrific way. And they flayed his skin. But someone like that is forever etched in the Jewish consciousness as a great hero. And what happens when we say he gave his life for nothing? But he's only one example. We have modern-day examples. Someone like Natan Sharansky, who did 120 days in a hunger strike. Can you imagine 120 days in the Gulag in a hunger strike? Every 2 days, the Soviets would come and push a pipe down his esophagus and pour this protein mix to keep him alive. 120 days. Why? For Judaism. Because he wanted to go to Israel and he wanted to, bring hope to the millions of Jews behind the Iron Curtain. All that for nothing? I think there's an element of cruelty to the conclusion that the Torah is not divine. Because once that goes, our religion goes as well. So we have to be very careful with our conclusions, and I'm not trying to say that alone proves one thing or the other, but it's very important for us to not be lackadaisical, be flippant about this, because we have to really be sure we know what we're getting into if we're coming to such a conclusion. That's number one. Now, over the years, there have been many classical analyses of the fundamental flaws of Bible criticisms. I want to talk about those a little bit, also talk about some other insights that maybe are not mentioned as much in the classical response. We have someone like Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman. He was a German rabbi and scholar. He was one of those great German scholars of the 19th century that managed to do everything. Was a professor of history and philosophy, and Phil wrote 100 books, and his approach was detailed, painstaking, systematically, verse by verse, word by word, arguing with the Bible critics. And there is merit to that. I think it's probably very boring for a lot of people to argue about every verse and going verse by verse, sentence by sentence, parsha by parsha, and painstakingly proving or disproving the claims and the allegations of the Bible. That's one approach. I think there are other approaches today. Recent archaeological discoveries. We mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. There have been many other discoveries that have called or that have disproven the alleged claims of anachronism of the early Bible critics. So, like we mentioned, an anachronism is where something is not properly dated. So, for example, the philosophical elements of the early Bible critics was that early religion couldn't have been as organized as it is portrayed in the Torah. So, if you have someone like Abraham in I think it's called the early Middle Bronze era, where he describes kings and rulers and roadways and organized laws. Like that kind of sophistication, organization that we have goes in counter to the kind of evolutionary model of history, wherein we have like kind of savages or less sophisticated anarchy, and eventually becoming more and more and more civilized.
Recently, there was an article I read that said there's an anachronism with Abraham and camels.
Oh yeah, I have it over here.
Oh,
how do you like that? I brought it here because this is a great example for my next point. How do you like that? It's in New York Times.
Yeah.
Yes, almost exactly 2 years ago, February 10, 2014. I have a lot to say about this article. Interesting. Now, someone like William F. Albright, who was someone who's used kind of archaeology to try to prove the Torah. I mean, we don't do that. I don't think archaeology goes either way. But he was very much a maximalist. He tried to use archaeology to prove the existence of the Bible. But he points out justly that this evolutionary model of unsophisticated culture and government developing into sophisticated, that is actually not true. In fact, the opposite is true in places like Egypt. Ancient Egyptian culture was very, very organized, very structured. It made a lot of sense. Like they had very sophisticated laws and culture, and that is not what is the what's called the Hegelian method of looking at the philosophy of religion, that it couldn't have been that organized that long ago. And we see today with archaeological discoveries that indeed that's actually not true. So those have been methods that other people talk about. There's a lot to read about that. I want to start with what you mentioned. And I'm going to make this claim. Maybe you'll agree with me. Maybe you won't. And I think this article proves what I want to say. And I think, and maybe you'll see this as a cop-out, but I think it's a good argument to be made, that there is going to be an inherent bias of the critics. It's like we mentioned, the starting point has always been this human authorship. There's never been a Bible critic that has ever contested or has ever accepted the premise of divine authorship. But we have this article here. What does this article say? This article, it's the New York Times, right? The height of journalistic integrity, correct? So I have it over here. You can Google lines. I disagree. I said that just satirically, right? This article says that the caption here is the headline: "Camels had no business in Genesis." Why? So this Israeli guy, shockingly an Israeli, would want to prove this, right? Noah Mizrahi. They discovered, the first line is like this. Camels probably had little or no role in the lives of such early Jewish patriarchs as Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. Okay? So we know, if you read Genesis, there's several episodes where Abraham has camels, where Eliezer has camels, where Joseph has camels, domesticated camels. And this is portrayed in this article as an anachronism because camels weren't domesticated 3,800 years ago. 1,800 years, 18th century BC, camels weren't domesticated. Why? Because they found, archaeologists here, I'll give you a quote here, use radiocarbon dating to pinpoint the earliest known domesticated camels in Israel to the last third of the 10th century BC. Centuries after the patriarchs lived and decades after the kingdom of David, according to the Bible, which is actually not true because David in the Bible is about the 9th century. So he's actually early, after that. So I don't know where they got that from. But either way, what's the claim? They have found some camel bones. They dated it. We are giving them the benefit of the doubt that they're accurate with their dating. We're not questioning that. Even though that can be questioned, other people have questioned. We're not questioning it for our context. They dated camels, domesticated camels, to 10th century BC. That proves, in their eyes, that Abraham, who lives 800 years prior, could not possibly have had that. Now, there's a fundamental flaw in that argument. The mere fact that you find camel bones, domesticated camel bones, that are 3,000 years old, that doesn't prove that that was the first domesticated camel ever. It doesn't prove it at all. There's absolutely zero evidence. But this is presented as an anachronism. It's anachronism. The Torah is not true, according to them. The Torah must have been written later, and therefore people who wrote it later were using what they knew as, the modes of transportation, domesticated camels, or the modes of animals that were commonly used. And they said, Abraham must have had it because we made it up. And how do we prove that? That's anachronistic because we found camel bones that are 10th century BC. And I read this, and my eyeballs are popping out almost. Like, how do you make such a claim? It's negligent to make such a claim. It's journalistic malpractice. If I go to the library and say, hey, I want to find a New York Times article, and I say, okay, I found one. It's from 1952, right? It talks about
It's the first one.
It must be the first one, right? Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. Right? To claim that there was a New York Times article about Hitler. You guys saw that? In 1919, where they put him in prison, and it was a short article, and that's the last we'll be hearing of him. So that was the point of the article. That must be anachronistic because I found a New York Times article in 1952, and therefore it couldn't have existed prior. So
they don't pay very well to New York Times anymore.
Huh?
They don't pay very well to New York Times anymore.
Well, to me, and how do you write that? The only way something like that gets through is if there's a bias. If anything that disproves the question of the Torah is rubber stamped through. Because otherwise, it's journalistic malpractice. The claim is so absurd, and yet it's there and it's still online. I can't believe it's still online. It's so absurd. And something like that, to me, shows that the bar of expectation of an argument for Bible criticism is very low. And someone who makes a claim like that is going to be allowed to be published, and it's still there 2 years later. Not only that, we mentioned this prior, I think that there's always been a presupposition that prophecy is impossible. I'll give you guys some examples. So Deuteronomy is presented as being the latest of the books. Right? It's 5th century. Now, there's a few reasons why the Bible critics claim that Deuteronomy came much later. Number one is that Deuteronomy has different, slight variations in kind of the style of writing. Now, if I just told you that, you would say, oh, well, that's legitimate, right? Who here knows what the first 15 chapters of Deuteronomy discuss? Anyone knows?
The entire Bible.
Huh?
The entire Bible.
Okay, well, not quite that. It's not the entire. Well, it does mention parts of the. But the first about 15 chapters, maybe even 20, exactly.
Well, there's a lot of it's Moses' speeches.
It's Moses' last will and testament, basically. Right. The first 2 verses of Deuteronomy say, these are the words of Moshe, and it tells him where it was, and this is what he said. Now,
does that mean it's not written divine, but that was written by Moses?
Well, no. What it means is that this is the words of Moshe. Now, how do we view it? We view it traditionally as God tells Moshe, write your speech. So Moshe writes his own speech. Now, God's still the author, it's just God's pulling a quote from Moshe, so to speak. Now, if I brought you a book...
Are you saying that
God's telling Moses to write your speech, but use my words?
No, God's telling Moshe, I want you to write. God tells me, hey, I want you to write a conversation that happened with Abraham, right? That's just a dialogue of Abraham within God's story. So here, there's a huge quote. I'm sorry?
So Moses is not the author of his speech?
Well, Moshe is the author of the speech, but that was his speech. Later on, God tells him, write your speech in the Torah. Does that make sense?
No.
I'll give you an example here. Let's say I have a book, right? I'm writing a book, and I want to pull a quote from some other author, right? I want to have a Mark Twain quote. Now, someone would examine my book and say, wait a minute. You read the Mark Twain quote, and you read what I wrote, and it's very different. It must be that this book has multiple authors. Now, obviously, the major hole in that argument is that, yes, it's my book, but I chose in my book to pull a quote from Mark Twain. So the fact that it's written in Mark Twain's words, and that's different than my words, doesn't disprove that I'm the author, obviously.
Wait, the author, there's your, no, I don't agree with that.
Go ahead. Tell me why not.
Okay, because plagiarism says if I'm attributing to Mark Twain, I cannot claim those to be my words.
But no one does claim those to be God's words. God is pulling a quote from Moshe.
So now
These are the words of
Now
Moshe.
you're saying God is writing it down.
Well,
Now
no.
you're saying God's the author.
God's the author.
If God's
But
the
it's not
author-
plagiarism because it says, if you read the first two verses of Deuteronomy, these are the words of Moshe.
So
God's saying this is a quote from Moshe.
God's telling Moses, these are your words. Now I'm reminding you what you said because you may forget.
And write them down. No, write them down. Write them down for posterity in the Torah.
But who created
Moshe
the
gave a
words?
speech.
So that's Moses' words.
Moshe gave a speech. And God says, I want you to include your speech into my book.
Right, but that's Moses' words in there.
Oh, yeah, of course. But it's a quote of Moshe in God's book. That doesn't change the fact that it's God's book, just because the words is different.
Moses wrote those words. So
Well, Moshe wrote the
that's
whole
part of
thing, but he's not the author. He's the
But
typist.
he's the author of his own words.
True.
Or is he
True,
only,
true,
is it
true,
like
true, true.
Or is it something where you have like a seance and you only say what God...
No.
No, it's simple. If I'm writing a book about the Civil War, and I'm quoting Lincoln's Gettysburg Address,
Right,
I
that-
wrote the book. Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address, but I wrote the book,
Thank
and
you.
I'm putting down Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in the book. I'm the author of the book that's telling you what Lincoln said.
And the fact that that may have stylistic differences between your words, that doesn't disprove anything.
Yeah, but so is God writing Moses'... I'm sorry.
No, Moses
I feel
wrote
like
the
a circular
speech.
argument.
God is simply quoting him in the book that God
That's
is
right.
writing.
No, Moses is writing it.
Moses wrote the
writing-
speech.
Yeah, that's right.
God is quoting Moses.
So Moses is
Why
writing
don't we
the
discuss
speech
this
that
after
God
so
It's
you
a-
can finish this? You can let him finish this.
Okay. So that's number one. And if you point to stylistic, of course there'll be stylistic differences. These words originated with Moshe, and therefore, of course, they'll be different than the words originated by God. Of course. Now, not only that, if you look at Deuteronomy, there's a lot of predictions. Now, if you presuppose that prophecy is not possible, then essentially you're saying that predictions that indeed came true must have been written after those events actually happened. Thus, events that are described in Deuteronomy that came true with the destruction of the first temple must have been written after the first temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed. Thus, it's a circular argument. It's because we are presupposing that prophecy is not possible, therefore it must be that Deuteronomy came afterwards, and that obviously is a weak argument. And now, Isaiah, this is another great example. Isaiah was always considered to be the product of two authors for the same reason. Because the end of Isaiah makes predictions that came true in the second temple's destruction. It must be that was written later. And actually, thanks once again to our discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we find many extant copies of Isaiah, word for word with Isaiah we have today, that were dated via scientific method to before those times. We now know that prophecy is possible, and it indeed is the product of an individual guy, and not later.
Can I ask a question on
Go
that?
ahead.
But doesn't a lot of that refer to the things that have happened in the past, but some of those past events occurred over hundreds of years, so Isaiah couldn't have lived that long?
Well,
Written
of
it
course,
all?
of course. But if Isaiah is a prophet, then the fact that it happens years later or years prior, that's not an impediment. Means
Doesn't make
time
sense.
is not going to be an
Part of
impediment.
it's written in the past and part of it's written in the
Right, a prophet's able to
future.
see. It means the idea of prophecy is that they not only what they encounter with their own physical eyeballs is what they can see, so to speak. They're called seers as well because they have capacity to see things. But that's the idea of prophecy. Whether you accept it or not, that's what prophecy means. And therefore, the fact that he lived at a specific point in time does not limit him to only being able to write about things that existed at that time. Now, go ahead.
Just without taking up a lot of time, God is the author of the Torah, and he's telling Moses what to write. Am I right, sir?
Yes, go ahead.
And the events that he's telling Moses, like Isaiah, is coming after Moses' death. Is that correct?
Well, no. Moshe writes only the 5 books of Moshe. Only Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, by the way, when is that written? That is written at the end of Moshe's life. It means Moshe writes it incrementally. He doesn't write it at Mount Sinai. He doesn't write the book of Numbers, of course, because those events hadn't happened. And if you're Korach, you wouldn't rebel against Moshe if you could read the book, right? But Moshe writes it before, and the Torah actually does talk about, the book itself does talk about Moshe writing it and giving it to the Jewish people. And I want to make another point here. This is, I think, goes to the crux of the argument that, like we said earlier, this is actually not a hard science. It's a very soft science, especially when we're dealing with trying to reverse engineer literature. If you have a lawyer who writes a brief to be read by the judge or by the jury, and then you have that same guy who has a car double parked next to him, and they write him a little note on the guy's dashboard telling him what you think about him. If you compare those two documents, right, what he wrote as in a brief and what he wrote to the guy who double parked and blocked him out, do you think you would compare them and say this is the same guy or not? Probably not, right?
Probably not.
So context matters. And therefore, the whole idea in general is very soft. It means the context will influence the writing style. Not only that, multiple names, right? I know for myself, in any given week, I am called at least 4 things. I go to the classes, people... That I know, right. Right, not behind my back, who knows what else goes, right? My kids call me Abba. Right? When mail comes, it's Mr. It's Mr. Jeffrey, And then people call me Yaakov, my wife calls me Yaakov, my friends call me Yaakov, and people in the class call me Rabbi. Does that mean I'm a different person? Of course not. It means relationships matter, right? Your relationship you have with someone, that will influence the way you talk to them. And this is what we've always said, that when God treats us in a certain way, he's presented with one name. He treats us in a different way, he's presented with a different name. And by the way, if you look at Rashi, remember, Rashi's in the 11th century, right? 1040 to 1105. When he sees a name of God, Elohim, which is a reference to power, and by the way, the word Elohim does not necessarily mean God. I'll give you many examples of that. You look at someone like, again, off topic here, of course, but someone like the guy who wrote Da Vinci Code. What's his name? Dan Brown. He's like, hey, look at Psalms 92. It says, you are the sons of Elohim, right? You're the sons of God. Well, what does that mean? It means we're the sons of God? Yeah, that sounds very Christian, right? The word Elohim means power. There is multiple times in the Torah the word Elohim is used to obviously talk about a man. For example, the cord is called Elohim. Ad ha-Elohim yavod varshem. We read it 2 weeks ago in the Parsha. To the power they will bring their argument. 2 people have argument, they go to the court. Moshe is told that you will be an Elohim to Pharaoh. God tells Moshe, you will be a master over Pharaoh. And he uses the word Elohim. So the word Elohim, when we talk about God, it's a reference to God's power. And power and judgment is frequently employed when God's being very strict, letter of the law with us. As opposed to the name, the tetragram, the 4-letter ineffable name of God, that's a reference to God's kindness. That's the name that God used to create the world, and therefore God created the world with kindness, and therefore when God's treating us with kindness, that's the name that's employed. And if you look at Rashi, every time it says one name or the other, they'll tell you, why is the tone here the tone of strictness or the tone of kindness? So And that's exactly a parallel to me being called different names, the relationship that influences the name. The fact that the Torah is not chronological. Even though this has really been discredited a long time ago, but there has been arguments in the past that talk about the fact that the Torah is not chronological. As if the editor or redactor made mistakes. We still see the mistakes of the editor. When
This doesn't match up with the holidays, like we talked about Passover 3 weeks ago.
Well, no, mostly in the narratives. In the narratives, you'll have Abraham's father died, and then Abraham's 75 years old. But if you do the math, Abraham's actually much older when his father dies. Well, we have never claimed. And by the way, if you ask any fourth grader in any Jewish school in Israel, why is it that question? They'll say Ein Mukdam Umuchar b'Torah. It's a line in the Talmud that's repeated multiple times. There's no prior or post in the Torah. The Torah is not chronological. The Torah finishes with one story, and it kills him off, so to speak, the character, right? Abraham's father is killed, even though it happened much later, and we go back to Abraham's storyline, because we're not going back to that storyline. And I'll give you guys another example, and I think this is enough evidence to dispel any myth that the Torah was ever intended to be chronological. We have a story of Joseph. Joseph and his brothers, and he's sold, and it's a terrible thing, and he goes down to Egypt. Smash cut, Judah and Tamar. Judah, he gets married, he has 3 kids, his kids get married, his older son dies, his next son dies, he has Tamar's waiting for the third. Everyone knows the story. This is, I think, Genesis 38 or 39. A whole story that obviously spanned multiple decades, right? Judah has to get married, his kids have to get married, his kids have to die, he has to have this very bizarre interaction with his daughter-in-law, she dressed like a prostitute, and they produce twins, right? Very bizarre episode that intersects right in the storyline of Joseph. And it says, and Joseph went down to Egypt. Did that all happen in the interim? No, clearly. Now, if you look at Rashi asked the question, like we said, asking the question is not the problem. Asking the question with intent to try to find what the message is, that's what we do. And Rashi explains, why is this section just intersected in between of a much bigger section? And he answers the question, But this was once claimed to have been a problem with the kind of the flow, the continuity in the Torah. Now, another question. I think this is maybe just for us to just ask ourselves. Let's assume that the Bible critics are right. Let's assume for a second they're right. So we have a book. We have traditions and folklore, etc., that are written down. There's multiple books written. And then we have the finalized book. And it gets delivered to us 4th, 5th century before the Common Era. At that time, historically, we know the Jews are already scattered. There's already a Jewish diaspora. So what you'll have to explain is how does such a book get disseminated across the entire Jewish world. We have Jews living in North Africa, Jews living in Europe, Jews living, of course, already in Arabia, in Persia. How do you have the delivery of the book at a time where Jews are scattered everywhere? Interesting, right? Because if the book was only finalized then, it has to be delivered now to the people, because we do know the people already were steadfastly observing it only a couple of 100 years later. We know that it's already in the hands of the Gentiles, right? 2,200 years ago. So we have to find a way, and this is, I think it's very hard for us to make this claim, that if the Torah was written so much later, finalized so much later, how does it get delivered and accepted when the Jews are everywhere across the world? Not only that, what does the book say? The book multiple times talks about Moshe writing it, and Moshe giving it to the people who experienced these tremendous miracles at Egypt, at Mount Sinai, the manna falling from heaven. And Moshe tells them, you guys saw the manna falling from heaven, this is the book I'm giving to you. Wait a minute, isn't that obviously disprove itself? Like, if the Torah is true, then it has to be that Moshe delivers the book to the very same people who ate the manna and who witnessed the Mount Sinai experience and who either them or their ancestors or their parents experienced the Exodus from Egypt. Because that's what it says, that Moshe gives the book to the people at the end of Deuteronomy. If I'm 2,500 years ago delivering the book to you guys, I'm going across, I'm the traveling salesman, I travel everywhere, and I have to make independent speeches to all these people to convince them all simultaneously, but not in unity, that this is all true, and they just read through the book and say, wait a minute, Rabbi Wolbe, I have a problem. It says that not you gave it to us, but Moshe. Who is Moshe? And what are these episodes that happened? And how do I know that this is true? And how come no one has a record of this besides for you? Yes?
I thought that he gave one book to each tribe.
That's true. Yes. Moshe gave one book to each tribe. I know, I agree with that. But we're saying, if we assume the Bible critics is true, let's actually play it out. Let's see what happens. What does that imply? And how does that get widely adopted by the people when they know for sure that it's false? And I think a good way for us to kind of analyze this question, and I think another spin, I think that makes it very interesting, is to ask the question, okay, fine. Let's now entertain the possibility of God authoring a book. Yeah. If God... exactly. Which is not discussed. I mean, this option is not discussed in Bible criticism. But let's ask ourselves some questions. If God wrote the book, would the book be written with the same format and same methodology as if a human wrote the book? It means what would be different? Better yet, what would the intention of the author be? It means it's kind of like a reverse engineer it. Let's assume that God is the author. How would that be different than if a human was the author? And by the way, if you play this out, you'll notice that once you accept the premise, or at least the possibility of divine authorship, if that's one of the options, all the questions get answered. Everything makes sense. And by the way, we actually have a way to do this. We have what's called the oral Torah. Now, oral Torah, I know it raises a lot of red flags in a lot of people's eyes. Oral Torah, what does that mean? Rabbinic law, all that. Let's put that aside. But the simplest understanding of what oral Torah does is it takes a book that is full of riddles and enigma and brings clarity to it. It's as if you have a book that's encrypted. It's written mysteriously, and then you paint the perspective of the oral Torah on top of that, and then it makes sense. So the book of the oral Torah, or the perspective of the oral Torah, is the decryption key to understand the written Torah. If you just had the written Torah, there's a lot of questions that are justly raised. If you actually look at the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Midrash, almost all these questions are actually answered. And they're actually addressed straight up. All of the textual problems are addressed. Not only that, I'll tell you something really cool here. Not only that, if you actually look at the perspective that we gain through the oral Torah, we see not only answers to our questions, but we see insights that we can never have imagined we would pick up on our own. For example, Jewish marriage, right? Presentation of the ring. That's what makes a couple married. If you're married, it's because you gave a item of value. The man gave the item of value to the woman, and said certain words. That creates marriage. That's what the Talmud says very clear. Now, everything that's in the oral Torah must be somewhere encrypted in the written Torah. Okay? With the possible exceptions about 8 or 9 things. Very, very short list. Maimonides makes a list of things that are called halacha l'moshe misinai. These things were given just by tradition, like how much matzah you have to have, volumes, etc. But besides for that, almost everything is actually in the Torah. Where in the Torah, I want to ask the biggest Bible expert here, who hasn't learned Talmud, where in the Torah does it say that marriage happens by transference of something of value from a man to a woman? And you know what? I guarantee you, if we spend the rest of our lives perusing through the Torah, poring over, analyzing, asking every question we could possibly ask, we probably won't find it. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Most likely we won't.
Eliezer gives the jewelry to Rebecca.
That's true, but that's not. Is that what makes the marriage? Who's to say that makes the marriage? Maybe when they met, they got married. So that's true, but that's actually not what that wouldn't be sufficient. So what you find?
Gave a camel, and that really messed it up. The camel wasn't there.
No, the camel was there; it just wasn't domesticated.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, actually, in the story of Rebecca fell off the camel, so maybe that actually does prove they were more unwieldy than we would imagine. But either way, the Talmud says, and this is an example of hundreds of these. The Talmud says that if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 25, you'll find the words ki yikach ish isha. When a man yikach, remember the word kach, man will marry a woman. And then all the way back in Genesis, with the story of Abraham buying a burial plot for Sarah, Hasade Asher, right? Nasati kesef hasada kach mimeni. The Hebrew words are the same words, kach, yikach, same word, to take. And there we know that Abraham bought it with 400 silver coins. We see money was used in that transaction. Says the oral Torah, this is how we know that marriage happens with money. How so? The same word in multiple places, they tell you that they are linked. That is a way to decrypt it. Like, if you read this 1,000 times, you would never imagine that those two are related in any way. But that is how we can decrypt the oral Torah, or the written Torah with oral Torah. And that tells you, hey, look, here it says, Ki yikach ish isha, man will marry a woman. Kach. Well, how does that happen? It doesn't tell us, right? Well, it does tell us. Because if you go all the way back, dial back, all the way back to Genesis, right? Abraham's wife dies. He wants to buy a place to bury her. And he says the word, Nasati kesav asada kach mimeni, I gave money. Take it. There we know that money or something of value is transferable. And by the way, you say, oh, whoa, who wrote that? Which human author put all those little laws in? And not only that, there's hundreds upon hundreds and hundreds of examples in the Talmud of these laws being deduced in this methodology. Now, to me, this is remarkable because this raises the bar of genius of a human author to write such a thing. Like, how could a human do that? And I'll give you one example. There's hundreds of examples called Zera Shavas. How could it, if you read the oral Torah and you see how much that exposes of the wisdom of the written Torah, you really have to start questioning yourself, okay, is it possible for a human to be this brilliant? It makes it more difficult to imagine some redactor putting it all together and obviously leaving lots of mistakes, because if we don't have the mistakes, we don't have the theory, right? If we don't have the mistakes of the redactor, we don't have the theory. On the other hand, we have such precision and such. I mean, it's a little bit oxymoronic. On one hand, the theory of the documentary hypothesis is predicated on the fact that it was a sloppy job, because otherwise we wouldn't find so many instances of these, of these discrepancies. On the other hand, the only way for us to accept the Torah is if there's such tremendous genius and it's so organized and so orderly, which is obviously a problem. Now, I want to say one more point before we finish, and we have some time for questions. 2 more points. The Constitution. So we just had the death of a Supreme Court justice, right? What's the Supreme Court doing? What's their role? Their role is to interpret a written document. What's the problem? The document only written 200 years. How's it possible that a document is 200 years old, written by humans, with the intention that other humans down the line will understand it, will have so much debate and disagreement? The answer is that written documentation alone is not enough, because it can be understood in a multitude of ways. It can be, there's inflection points, there's slight differences in use of grammar and use of words, and then there's some room for ambiguity, and then there's the obvious questions of, well, had they known how prevalent guns would be and how powerful they would be, maybe they wouldn't have it. Who knows, right? That's a debate that we have today. And we see an example of a document written by humans, very short document, written by humans with the explicit intention of it being understood in future generations, and we have no idea how to interpret it. And it's always 5-4, right? We clearly see that if a human writes a document, a very intelligent human writes a document with the intent of it being understood by other humans down the line, it most likely will fail. If God wrote the Torah, and God had the same intent for it to be written, to be understood by humans down the line, perhaps he would write it in a way that it will be able to withstand decades and millennia of time and still be understood. It means that maybe the reason why there's so many discrepancies is specifically because God is writing a book that's very different than the way a human would write it. And thus, if we're assuming human authorship, and we're within that mode of reference, and then we see things that a human would never write, a fallible human would never write, if we question maybe an infallible God would write, maybe then that would shed light onto these apparent discrepancies in the Torah. And lastly, I want to say this point quickly, because I actually spent 5 lectures on this particular point. So I'll try to condense it into maybe 20 seconds or something like that. If you actually look at the Torah, more specifically Deuteronomy, you find very pointed predictions. Predictions that fly in the face of reason. And predictions that happened way before the events happened. We find multi-pronged predictions. For example, the idea of an eternal nation. The Jews will exist forever. Yet, they will be small in number. Yet, they will be scattered. They won't have their own homeland or language or country or culture. They will have anti-Semitism, and they will remain small in number and come back to Israel. That's 5 predictions that all of them are in opposition to logic. An eternal nation, how does the nation stay eternal? Not by being small in number or by being hated or by being disrupted multiple times or by being scattered. That doesn't happen. Yet all those are predicted in the Torah, and all those we know are true. Not only that, going back to Israel. The Torah predicts we'll go back to Israel, and now we know very much that that is indeed true as well. And the question we have to ask ourselves, okay, let's assume there's human authorship. How does this human gain insight, or what gives him the gumption to make such a bold prediction? A prediction, by the way, that has never happened in human history, that a nation exiled from the land come back to reestablish sovereignty. It's never happened. There's other examples.
He came back with Babylon.
Well, it's happened to us, that's right, I agree. It's happened to us twice. But it hasn't happened, and the reason why is because these things don't happen. You have a nation that's scattered from the land, they disappear. And there's hundreds and hundreds of examples. History is littered with examples of nations, of people that were disrupted and sent away, and they're gone. And yet, we buck that trend, and it's predicted in the Torah. And not only that, all the themes, all the obstacles to us doing that are also predicted in the Torah. Let me ask you a question. Who wrote that? Well, if God wrote it, well, God can do that, right? If a human wrote it, even the most brilliant human in the world, they can't possibly make it. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't go on a limb to do something which is so unlikely to happen, and indeed we see it did happen. Either way, in conclusion, I appreciate everyone coming here. This was a lot of fun. I encourage people to do take a closer, critical look at the Torah. That's what we have been doing throughout the centuries. And to ask yourselves these important questions. There's a lot very interesting, very fascinating, and I think that the resurgence of interest in the Torah is a very good thing. But let's be very careful with what conclusions we draw, because they can be very dangerous, and the gravity of a conclusion that invalidates Judaism is very dangerous, and we want to avoid it. Thank you so much. And I want, as well, if everyone could please